Well, as you know, the Catholic Pope, Pope Francis, has passed away. And of course, they just had his funeral on Saturday. And of course, now's the time they're going to start electing the cardinals. They're going to start electing a new pope. And that's what the world is talking about, who the new pope is going to be. Well, so what we're hearing and what you're going to be hearing for a long time, and in fact, what the Catholic Church has said for a long time, is that this tradition of picking a new pope goes back 2,000 years. It actually doesn't. Catholic Church hasn't been around that long. But of course, that's the assumption, that's the belief, of course, that Jesus Christ himself established the papacy, that is the office of the Pope, that he established it by choosing Peter, the Apostle Peter, as the first Pope, according to Matthew 16:18, at least according to their understanding. This is the main verse used in the understanding that Peter was made the first Pope, and so we've been having successors to Peter ever since. Well, of course, none of this is true, although it is a long-held belief and claim of the Catholic Church. Of course, we'll talk about it.
Commentary, discussion, Bible teaching, and more with AK Richardson.
Please hear and learn. Change your
yes,
mind.
so it was Peter,
Shift and turn.
the first
Take
Pope.
a break.
This is not the first time I've talked about this, of course, and of course, this debate over Matthew 16 and Peter and what Jesus said to Peter and who he built the church on or what he built the church on, of course, has been going on for a long time. But I actually don't think this is that complicated, to be honest with you. And we're going to look at it. I got some clips of some Catholics talking about this very issue. I have Trent Horn queued up. I have Cameron Bertuzzi, I don't know how you say his name. I've got him queued up. And we got some clips to talk about this issue and to talk about the exegesis and the understanding of what Jesus said to Peter. So, understandably, it is something that the whole world talks about because the Catholic Church has been around for a long time, not 2,000 years. I'd say maybe 1,500. The Catholic Church does not go back to the New Testament era. That is, the first century does not go back to Jesus, does not go back to Peter. And if you were going to have a historical discussion, that would not be overly difficult to see. Council of Nicaea, 325. Council of Nicaea in the 300s, you don't have a pope. You have no mention of the pope. And of course, we can go into the historical discussion, but no, the Catholic Church doesn't go back that far, and Peter was not made pope. We're going to look at that here in a little bit. But, that is something to keep in mind. I remember when Candace Owens, she's a conservative political commentator, was talking about thinking through Catholicism, because she had married lots of people know who she is. That's why I'm talking about her. She had married a Catholic. She was not Catholic. And, she talked, and you can kind of tell that it was going to be where she would change over to Catholicism, of course. But she said as much. She said that she was thinking about it. And she said that the seed that her husband, her Catholic husband, and by the way, both of them, and he has been on, Matt Fraud is his name, I think, and other places talking about these kinds of things. But she was talking about how he had planted this seed in her head. That, and the question that he had asked, I guess, was something to the effect of, was there no saved Christians before Martin Luther? And that's what got her thinking and kind of contemplating Catholicism. And, I would love to have discussion with Candace Owens, and of course, who wouldn't on these topics. But it's not a problematic question to answer at all, because the question assumes that, first of all, that the Catholic Church itself goes back to Christ. Now, I would have to turn the question around to my Catholic friends, and then we'd have the historical discussion. I would have to ask, though, were there no saved Christians before Catholicism came into development? Because that's what happened. It was a development over several hundreds of years. It was not around for the first several hundred years, 400, 500 years. You know, it's interesting because, oh, by the way, and then the other part of that answer to that question that Candace Owens was contemplating was, though there's been Christians around, not every professing Christian in the world before Martin Luther held on to and acknowledged and confessed and believed all the doctrines of Catholicism and the Pope. Of course not. I mean, there was Christians. No doubt Catholicism, the Catholic Church, was the dominant force around, professing to be Christian and the church. But so, no, I mean, the Catholic Church developed, you know, and that's why, by the way, a lot of Protestants, and this goes back to some people who, you know, don't even, who will lay the Catholic Church the charge of inventing Christmas and Easter. You know, it's been said, well, those are Catholic holidays. And I always say to them, once upon a time, you know, I said the same thing, but I always say, these days, I say, you know, that's giving the Catholic Church too much credit. They weren't around. Most definitely with Easter. You know, Easter was, the dating of Easter was talked about in the Council of Nicaea. There was no Catholic Church. There was no Pope. Now, were there things that had already worked into development that eventually, with other things, culminated into what is known as the Catholic Church? Sure, absolutely. But there was no Catholic Church. And I'm talking about the Catholic Church we know, right? I mean, we're not talking about how some of the early fathers would have used the word Catholic. The word Catholic means universal. Everybody should keep that in mind. So you will hear people, or you will read, rather, people from these early centuries sometimes reference the Catholic Church, but they just mean the universal church. That means the whole Christian church. They weren't talking about a church that calls itself the Catholic Church as it is defined as the Roman Catholic Church. So keep that in mind. But nevertheless, this is appropriate to talk about. I mean, not only is because of current events with the Pope that they've had for a little over a decade now. When did he become Pope? Pope Francis. Not only because he has passed and they're electing a new Pope, but do you know the Catholic Church is being discussed everywhere because it is a political institution, very much so. World leaders, they talk to the Pope, and when he talks, the news reports what he says, and he is the spiritual leader, whoever the Pope is at any given time. He is the spiritual leader of billions of people that call themselves Christians. The Catholic Church is the largest single group professing to be Christians. Now, I don't think they outnumber Protestantism as a whole, but any one group that calls itself Christian, they are the largest. And so, very relevant. It's a very current event, and so, well, here we are. And so we're going to dive into, once again, the text of Matthew 16. And it's not just Matthew 16. The whole New Testament, I think, is very clear on this. You will not see an office that we call the papacy in the New Testament. And so, very relevant. So, be prepared. Turn to Matthew 16, of course. But nevertheless, we're going to get into this. I do got clips. I said, I'm looking at something here real quick. I do got clips of some Catholic apologists that I am going to pull up and listen to some things they say. Actually, we're going to just kind of pull up some brief clips as we look into the text. Now, some people I could foresee it already, saying, well, why do you take so long to get to the text? No, all of this that I'm talking about is a part of the subject. It isn't just jump on and go to the text. Now, sometimes side topics in the beginning, yeah, I mean, I do delay sometimes. That is a thing I do. I'm a repetitive person at that. But no, all of this stuff is very relevant to the issue. And this is a very current event thing. But let me turn somewhere here. As we prepare to look at the Matthew 16. Here my eye cannot fall on where I'm looking here, or where I'm wanting to. There it is. This is. So, the idea of a papacy, again, that's the office of the Pope in the New Testament. It's just absurd. It's not only is it absolute silence, and by the way, it's not just an argument from silence. We're talking about when we're talking about the papacy, as we're going to see, is the most important position in the church on earth. He is the spiritual leader of billions of people. And he is the man that world leaders go to, has been for quite some times. When he speaks infallibly, ex cathedra, when he speaks dogmatically from the seat, that determines doctrine. And he can anathematize through this seat people and concerning what they believe. I mean, the fact that that is not seen, that's some allowed silence. And it's very significant. That cannot be ignored. But when Paul the Apostle, and we're talking about decades into the future here from Christ's ministry, when he talks about gifts to the church? Now, I got to ask, is the papacy a gift? I mean, if the apostleship is a gift, surely the papacy. I mean, Peter himself was an apostle. But, when Paul is talking about this, he says, now you are Christ's body. Christ's body is speaking about the church. Metaphorically, the church is his body on earth. We continue his ministry and act and do what he would have done. Well, the Catholic Church claims to be the one true church. That's been the traditional teaching with Pope Francis and modern Catholics. I think some of that has been diminished, but that is the age-old belief of the church. But he says, now you are Christ's body and individually members of it. And God has appointed in the church first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, and miracles, and gifts of healing, helps, administration. Various kinds of tongues are all apostles. Okay, so the point he's making is you have all these things as a part of the church, these gifts. Not everybody gets to share in the things. What isn't that interesting? If the most important aspect of the church on earth, the papacy, is simply not mentioned. Does Paul not know about the papacy? Paul himself, the apostle, the greatest apostle to the Gentile world, the non-Jewish world that you had, and he didn't know about the papacy? Well, he knew how the church was structured, right? Now, he knew about the apostleship. He said God has given first apostles, second prophets, and yet no papacy. And Paul never mentions, he's got other lists like this, by the way, and he never lists the papacy. I believe that's very significant, don't you? So, when you're going to hear in the news, especially now, because of the new election of the Pope coming up and the death of Pope Francis, of this age-old tradition, no, there is no papacy. Paul knew of nothing, and he mentions the apostles, of course, and teachers and prophets, but the most important of all, greater than the apostles, we are told, is the Pope himself. Peter was preeminent of the apostles as a pope, and yet Paul knows nothing of it. Nowhere in his writings. Well, that's pretty significant because there was no papacy, as we will see in many other ways. But if we go to Matthew 16, this is the traditional text that our Catholic friends tell us is the establishment by Christ of Peter as the Pope of the church. Okay. And I want to remind you the significance of this position. And now it's quite obvious by the very nature of its political position in the world and its level of authority in the Catholic Church itself, the significance of this issue, right? And the importance of discussing and having right this position, biblically speaking. That is the papacy, the Pope. Is there a Pope? Was Peter the first Pope? Did Jesus establish a Pope? Well, you know, the Catholics certainly know that this is a significant issue in dividing Protestants from, and Protestants just simply really just means non-Catholic as we use. So, you know, here's Trent Horn and Joe something, I forget, talking, and they're both Catholics. They do debates. They're apologists for the Catholic Church, especially Trent Horn. You're going to see him on the right.
But
this is Trent Horn. Now, he's pretty well known as a Catholic apologist these days. So, yeah. Now, someone said, others, I don't know, Aaron Gallagher. I don't know him at all. I've heard that name. I think people keep asking me about him, but I don't know him. Don't know nothing about him. But yeah, I imagine people are putting out lots of videos on this because of this is current event right now. We had just had the death of Pope Francis, the controversial Pope, and we got a new one coming up. So no doubt that'll be the case. All right, so here's them talking about it.
But today I wanted to ask you, Joe, about the papacy, because you wrote a book, Pope Peter,
defending the church's most distinctive doctrine in a time of crisis.
Because it really is. When it comes down to it, the one doctrine that divides Catholicism from non-Catholicism.
Exactly. Like, you can't, they're more important. Like, I intentionally didn't call it the most important doctrine, right?
And by the way, if you are listening on podcast, I should point out, because I said Trent Horn is on the right. Trent Horn was the first one speaking. The one currently speaking is another guy. Trent Horn was the first guy speaking. The guy currently speaking when I push play is not Trent Horn.
Belief in God is more important than belief in the Pope.
Right. The Trinity is the central mystery of the Christian faith.
Right. But there are all sorts of Christians who believe in the Trinity who don't believe in the papacy. So that's not enough to distinguish Catholic from non-Catholic. Even something like the structure of the church or the real presence.
Right, because the Orthodox.
Exactly. So if you want to know whether you should be Catholic or not, the easiest one answer is, well, is the Pope really instituted by Christ?
Right.
And if the papacy is of apostolic and divine origin, you should be Catholic. And if it isn't, you shouldn't be.
Well, then, so you wrote your book, Pope Peter.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's one of the main issues. I'd say even in early history, when there was a development of the things, and the Catholic Church is a culmination and a collection of developments in early history, early Christian history. The papacy and the Mass are significant elements. One thing that distinguishes Eastern Orthodox, by the way, not that there's only one, but one of the big ones that distinguishes, they're like the Catholic Church without the Pope. But, so you do have that. But the Catholic Church and the Mass, the Eucharist, as they call it, these are significant developments. And I think you can clearly see those in history. Then you see a Catholic, you could see what has become significantly developed enough to be called the Catholic Church. And then they gained a lot of prominence throughout the next centuries, especially when Rome fell. When Rome fell, the biggest and the most significant, powerful force to give some stability in that world after the fall of Rome, in a chaotic world, was the Catholic Church. And so that's why they became so powerful. And they were called the Holy Roman Empire. But nevertheless. So you see what they're saying. I mean, they're saying this is significant. If you don't accept the papacy, don't become a Catholic. Well, I would amen that. So nevertheless. Okay, so let's look at this. And I feel like it's so simple. Actually, I did it when I did a video on this. I feel like every time it's like, this is so simple. But, so in Matthew 16, the very well-known text where Jesus asked his disciples, who do you say that I am? Now, first he asked who people say I am. They give the answers that they have heard, and then they answer, of course. And let's see, where do we start? No, I'll just start in 13. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea, or Caesarea, as people say both ways, Philippi, he was asking his disciples, saying, who do people say the Son of Man is? And they said, some say John the Baptist. Herod said that. And others Elijah, but still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. He said to them, but who do you say that I am? And Simon answered and said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered and said to him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. Bar-Jonah is the son of Jonah. That's what that means. His father was named Jonah. So blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, because flesh and blood, humanity, did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter. Now, Peter, this is where it becomes significant. Peter is Petros. And if you could see it on the screen, it's rock. Basically saying you are. So his name was Simon, and he was renamed earlier at a different time as Rock. And that's where Peter, this common name in our day and age, Peter, that's where it comes from, it's the Bible. It means rock. Petros. And so he's saying, I say to you that you are rock. This name that he had been given by Jesus. This wasn't his birth name. In fact, he gives him his birth name right here. Or he names his Simon. That was his birth name. And I say to you that you are rock, and upon this rock I will build my church. Now, of course, it is going to be pointed out that this is Petra. This is the feminine form. Feminine, do I say that right? Feminine form of rock. So, Peter, Petros, that's the masculine form of rock. And then you got here, upon this rock, that's the feminine form of the same word. I will build my church, and the gates of Hades, or as people will say, Hades. But the gates of Hades, that's not hell, by the way. It's not what we call hell. That's death, basically. Sheol, where dead people go, will not overpower it. So, you are Peter, you are Petros, and upon this Petra I will build my church, and the gates of Sheol, the gates of death, will not overpower it. That is the church. They will not overpower the church. I will give you the keys. Now here's the significant portion. I will give you, Peter, the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Then he warned the disciples that they should tell no one, and that he was the Christ. So we know the argument. In fact, I had a whole video of Cameron Bertuzzi, defending the Catholic interpretation of this passage, but I clipped out one portion of it that I'm going to look at here in a moment. But this is their argument. Okay, so he establishes the church on Peter. They say, you see, he says that Peter's the rock, and on this rock the church is built. That's the papacy. That's that office that he's establishing with Peter. Peter becomes the first pope. Pope means father, by the way, papa. Papa. There's a Spanish word. If you speak Spanish, you recognize it too. And by the way, I don't remember, depending on its pronunciation, either means potato or father. And I forget. I get confused which is which. So I don't know if papa in Spanish is potato or, depending on the pronunciation, or father. But, but nevertheless. So, and that's what they say. Peter is the first pope, and the church is built. That the papacy is the significant institution. He's the leader. He's the one that runs the Catholic Church on earth. They say that the pope is the visible head of the church on earth. Now, of course, they will accept and they will acknowledge Jesus, of course, is the head of the church, the invisible head, the head of the church on earth, but the visible head of the church on earth is the Pope. Now, of course, you have to ask, of course, they say that, but how many heads does a body have? How many heads does a body have? Well, if you got two heads running a body, you're going to have a problem. I'm just here to tell you. No, you need one head to run a body. And so this idea about having a visible head on earth and Christ, that's two heads, of course. And, of course, he's never said to be the head of the church. Jesus doesn't say that here. It says it nowhere in the New Testament. And Jesus is said to be the head of, it's his body. Now, we just read a text. In the body, in Colossians, it says it is, speaking metaphorically, of course, the church is Christ's body. Well, if it never calls Peter's body. That should be significant to us. Okay, but I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. But this is their understanding that he says because of the greatness of Peter's profession of faith and because of his leadership and what he sees in Peter, Jesus says, I'm building my church and I'm building it on you, Peter. And they say he gives Peter these keys of the kingdom, and the kingdom here is the church. Now, they are correct about that the kingdom here is about the church. When he goes on to say, I will build my church and I will give you the keys of the kingdom. Well, the kingdom and the church here are used interchangeably. Now, that's not to say, by the way, now sometimes we overstate, and it's understandable, but sometimes it's oversimplified to say that the church and the kingdom are the same thing. Well, not exactly. They're not. In some respects, they are. The kingdom is larger than the church. The church is the Christians who have been brought into the kingdom on earth. So it is a category of the kingdom. The kingdom is larger. It includes angels. Angels are not in the kingdom. It includes innocent children. They're not in the church, but they are in the kingdom. His rule is over all of the world, but the church are those who have actually voluntarily in faith submitted themselves to Christ as king. So the kingdom is broader than the church. So it's not exactly accurate to say the church and the kingdom are the same thing, but I know where people are coming from. The church, in this context, of course, and the kingdom are used interchangeably, but one is broader than the other. But, okay, so it says, I'll build my church on you, Peter, and I will give you the keys of this church, and that much is accurate. And whatever you bind on earth, and this is the authority that he has, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. He's got the authority of heaven on his side here, and this is the understanding. And so for 2,000 years, we've had successors to this throne, successors to this seat that Peter occupied. Okay, you got so many problems with that. Number one, you don't get a successor. Even if it were true that this passage is where Jesus is establishing the papacy, building the church, metaphorically speaking, using the carpentry language, metaphorically building the church on Peter, or that is, speaking literally, establishing Peter as the significant role other than himself on which the church operates and functions. Okay, even if that were true, you don't have a succession, and you cannot get successors to Peter in the New Testament. You never find it. You never find about the qualifications of a successor to Peter. Now, you do have in Acts chapter 1 a successor discussed to the fallen Judas, who was an apostle, and we'll get to that here in just a second. But nothing about, but that's very pointed and very specific to the apostleship of Judas. But you never have a succession to this office of papacy, this office that Peter uniquely has. Where is it? And so significant is this that you don't have anything discussed in the New Testament? You got a succession to an apostle, but you don't have a succession mentioned or anything about it talked about to the papacy, which is preeminent to the apostleship? Again, what does this tell you? It tells you that this has been invented. This was invented after the fact, the papacy. Now, I got a lot of Catholic friends. Now, listen, of course, this is how we discuss. You don't have to be offended. And, I step on your toes, you step on my toes later. That's how this works, right? But if you're a Catholic, I want you to listen carefully to what I'm saying. I know that we all come to passages that we use to defend things. We come to passages, we have bias, right? We have biases, we have preconceived notions here and there. We all do that. As my Calvinist friends tell me all that we all got presupposition. Yes, but the key is recognizing it and ignoring it when you exegete the text so that it does not influence your interpretation. Now, you know that from Matthew 16, nothing is discussed of a succession. So that will go on for 2,000 plus years. And besides that, even if it was true that the church is being built upon Peter, you don't have an office. Okay, Peter, what is said about Peter is said about Peter the person. This is not an establishment of an office. And we talk about office, by the way, for those of you who don't know. Maybe for some of you Gen Zs, no disrespect, but we're not talking about a room called an office. We're talked about a position, a functional position of authority within the church. And by the way, I should say that if you don't know, the church is not a building either. It's not a place. Every one of us should get that out of our vocabulary. When we talk about going to church or the church, when we look at the building, that's not what it is. The church of the New Testament is never a building or place or location. It is the people that have been brought into the kingdom of Christ, brought into salvation by submitting themselves and obeying Christ and obeying his gospel. They are Christians. They are called the church. It's never a building. And I recommend everybody listening to me to get out of the habit of referring to going to church. You don't go to church. You meet with the church. You assemble with the church. You go to a building. You go to a location. So that's my recommendation there. But the church is the people. But you don't have an office being established here. You have something being said about a person, Peter. But whatever is said of Peter cannot be then translated into, okay, this is a position, and then there will be successors. How do you get that out of all this? People say, well, if the church is built upon it, it has to be continual. No. As a matter of fact, just the opposite. Because what a church, what a building, you see, this is the metaphor being used, is the building of an institution being discussed as if it's a building, right? Well, a building is established and built upon a foundation, and you only lay a foundation in the first stages. You don't keep laying the foundation. So it's just the opposite. Not only if it was an office, would it not be, is nothing said about it being, nothing said about successors. You, in fact, only lay such an office one time. Now, I know the response. Well, but the foundation is always there. Yes, but the foundation is laid once. That's why you Catholics don't believe in successors to the apostles in general, right? And they're a part of the foundation, which is also a problem for their interpretation here. So a foundation is laid once, in fact. But no, nothing is said of successors, and nothing is said of an office. This is something said to Peter. Okay, but what more? Okay, well, let's think about this. Now, I'll tell you where I come from here. And we got to discuss the different things said. Now, I know emphasis by non-Catholics generally is going to be on the distinction in masculine and feminine forms that I mentioned earlier on the words rock. So Peter is masculine. Let's see if I can pull up something here. So, Peter is masculine, but he says, and he changes the gender of by the way, side issue here. You know where the word gender comes from? It was a linguistic term. Anyway. Theological squirrel. Okay, so he says that you are Peter, right? Petros, Kai epi upon this taute, te Petra, this rock, feminine. Oikodomeso, I will build, future. Okay, so that's where the emphasis is going to be for a lot of non-Catholics. That's not where I go to, because I get it, right? I mean, what the response to that is. Well, so what is said though by the non-Catholics is said, no. Peter is not the rock on which the church is built, because the rock that is built upon is feminine. Yeah, that's not where I go. Now they're trying to distance Peter here from the rock on which the church is built. That's not where I go, and I'm going to tell you why. Because, well, of course, the church here, ekklesion here, but it's ecclesia, right? Ecclesia. Yeah. Well, ecclesia is feminine. Of course, it's going to use, it makes sense that the rock on which it's built, ecclesia feminine, is going to need a feminine word. I mean, so anyway, I get there, but I'm not wanting to delve into that, and I'm going to tell you why, because I think there's better ways to go here. I don't even think that's all that significant here. If anything with the language here is significant, and I think it is significant, but if anything is significant, it's the change in person. Not the change in gender, but the change in person. So if I were going to pick the language, if I was going to pick that hill to battle on, I would pick the distinction in, or the difference, the change of person. Because he says, I say to you that you are Peter, and upon this third person now. So it is second person. Now, if you flunked English, second person is when the speaker references the person they're speaking to. So if I say you, the audience listening to me right now, you are second person. So he says, and I say to you that you, second person, singular, Peter, you are Peter, and upon this third person now, we shift a person. And so that is somewhat problematic, right? And the fact that you are Peter, and upon this, that's the fact that you shift persons. But I'm not even going to spend my time there, because I think it becomes such more significant even when we look at more important things. You see, because I really don't have an issue with Peter being established as a part of this foundation. I don't have really a problem as far as this topic goes with the church being built upon Peter. You know why? Because the same thing is said by the rest of the apostles. Here's what becomes significant. And if you have not studied this issue, especially if you're a Catholic and you're on the fence about it, or a Protestant on the fence about it, I want you to think about these things. Hey, I don't tell you what to believe. I tell you what I believe, and I tell you what the evidence is, what the information is. You decide for yourself, but I'll speak pretty confidently here because I think this is an easy one. Nothing is distinct of other than, well, I'll say this, nothing significant with the establishment of the church is said to Peter that is not said explicitly or implicitly to the other apostles at other times. So the metaphor of building a church and building it up on this foundation and saying Peter's the foundation, but the foundation includes every other apostle. We know that. Okay, so let's go there. Ephesians chapter 2. Talking about the church. Let's see here. Oh, I went into 3 there. Now, talking to this primarily Gentile Christian church, Paul has been making the point that they have been made one with the Jewish saints because, there is the church of the spiritual Israel, by the way. That's why I'm not a dispensationalist. Different topic, theological squirrel. But I did shoot it, because some good theological bullets there. I did shoot the bullet. I did shoot the squirrel, but nevertheless, Paul says, "Then you are no longer strangers and sojourners, but you are fellow citizens with the saints." Now there he's talking about Jewish saints, "and are of God's household." Notice we still got this metaphoric language, which Paul does pick up from Christ, of this temple. It's God's house. It's God's temple. The Christians are God's household, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets. And this is New Testament prophets, by the way. Now, we know that from what is said in chapter 3. Nevertheless, side issue, Christ Jesus himself being the cornerstone. The most important part of the foundation is Christ, in Paul's understanding. Catholics would say, well, amen. Amen, brother. Okay, but interesting, because the other significant aspects of the foundation is not Christians in general, so we got something else prominent. Of course, the foundation is something unique from the stones that are built upon it, right? Well, if Christ Jesus himself is the most important part, what's something else lesser important but still important? Well, the apostles and prophets. Not only does he not mention the Pope, which would be the most significant other than Jesus, right? The other head of the church, they say, the visible head on earth. And Paul says nothing about it once again. Now, we saw his other list. But when talking about the foundation, and remember, the foundation is the metaphor Jesus used in Matthew 16, claimed by our Catholic friends to be the establishment of the most significant position in the church. And Paul recognizes Jesus, of course, and the apostles and prophets as a part of this foundation. Where's the Pope? Well, he's not there, of course. That's the point. There is no papacy. This was invented after the fact by people. This was invented hundreds of years later. So all the apostles, according to Paul, are a part of this foundation. So I don't really have a problem with including Peter as a part of what the church is built upon, because this includes the rest of them as well. So now going back to this. So this authority given to Peter to bind and loose, the keys given, this is metaphoric language of authority being given about the church. Okay, well, is that unique? Okay, they're all a part of the foundation, okay, but anything else distinctly given to Peter? Well, concerning this, concerning the authority of binding and loosing, well, this authority given to Peter here, let's look at it once again. He says, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. Okay. Is this distinct to Peter? Well, no, it's not. If you go on Matthew 18, the same thing is going to be said. Where are we? Okay, this is verse 15. I say, okay, truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. This is not just Peter. This is the apostles here. Now, this is said in other places. And so here's the same authority, not just given to Peter. Now, that destroys the claims by the Catholic Church, because these are not unique to Peter. If there's a papacy, the rest of the apostles are papist. And so it's not. Now, we're going to look at something else here. But someone asked, relevant question, what do you think of the late Dr. Heiser's suggestion that this rock is Mount Hermon connected with the Enonic tradition of the Watchers? I don't think much of it. I think the rock, there's only two viable interpretations. That it does reference Peter because of his place as a leader, as an apostle of the early church, just like the rest of them, which is why they're all included in the foundation. or it's really the confession that Peter himself makes, which the rock then being Jesus himself. You know, this profession that Peter made, that Peter's a rock because of his acknowledgement and acceptance of the rock itself, which is Christ. So either one of those is fine, and I don't have to die on either one of those hills, because what is said about Jesus, or what is said about Peter, if that's what it means, is said about the rest of the apostles. That's the most significant thing. And so, now where was I? Well, I'll tell you where else I can. Well, so we got Matthew 16 here. Now, something is said, though. But what about the language of the keys? What about the language of the keys itself? Well, we're going to talk about that. And we're going to hear from Cameron Bertuzzi on this. But I do want to say, by way of reminder, you guys, if you like, if you appreciate, and if you benefit from the content that is put out here on this podcast, share it, tell everybody about it. Like and subscribe to the podcast on YouTube so that you will know when it comes out live. But share it on the YouTube or share it on and let everybody know about the podcast platforms that have the audio. And it'll come out after the fact. We go live here on YouTube with the podcast. Afterwards, it goes out to podcast platforms in audio. Share the love. You know, that's tell everybody about the podcast. And you yourself, if you download these things, you can listen to. That's what I like to do. Listen when I'm, doing other things when I can. Also, just remember, you guys are appreciated when it comes to these things, because word of mouth, I think, goes a long way. And that helps get this on the search results. But also, look me up on Twitter. I'll probably call it Twitter to my dying day. I hate the name X. So but look me up on X, Twitter, AK Richardson 2. AK Richardson 2. And, that way you'll be able to see and even share links and things I send out on Twitter as well. All right, so but what about the language of the keys? Now, this is what they're going to say is, yes, the binding and loosing is given, but not the keys. So this is something distinct. Now, so let's listen to Cameron Bertuzzi. Now, who is Cameron Bertuzzi? Well, I don't actually know a whole lot about him. Cameron Bertuzzi he had a very I know this. He has a very popular YouTube channel. It's called Capturing Christianity. And he was very popular for a long time, and then at some point converted to Catholicism. And this was controversial, I guess, because YouTube, this is significant. And by the way, I got another point, very relevant to what we're talking about here. Now, if you're an older generation, you're thinking, well, what do these people matter and stuff like this? I'm here to tell you, the days of cable TV and of local television, the local channels, the YouTube and podcast, they place cable TV and the old channels and radio in their shadows. I think, President Trump used social media, Twitter, and these media, and he went on podcast. So I know older generations probably are a little puzzled about the references to podcast and social media and YouTube. That's because this far surpasses anything done on radio. Radio still got a hold somewhere, but this far surpasses. So individuals like Cameron Bertuzzi, they have these, and these other people, Joe Rogan, all these people who have these very successful social media platforms and podcasts. This is where the message is going out. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because not only just because I'm referencing a popular podcast, is he a podcast, YouTube channel, but because Catholicism has a stronghold. I don't know if it has the strongest hold, But Catholicism is very popular on social media. You got a lot of influencers going to it too, by the way. You got Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson is not a Catholic, I understand, but what do I mean by that? Well, I suspect that one day he may convert to Christianity, and if so, probably going to be Catholicism because his wife is Catholic. So I would look out for that. But more so, you got this guy who converted to Catholicism, and lots of people were talking about it at the time. People were asking me, hey, will you talk about this? And I said, I might, but I didn't know much about him. And also, who's someone else? Candace Owens, as I mentioned earlier, very popular conservative political commentator, converted recently to Catholicism. Her husband was Catholic. You got Matt Walsh, who's another popular political commentator. He's Catholic. Michael Knowles is Catholic. And so Catholicism is very popular out there on these YouTube channels, these podcasts. So very relevant to be talking about these things. All right, but anyway, so he converted to Catholicism, and so that made a big there was much ado on social media when he did. I guess I never listened to much of him. I've listened to several of his things, especially when he interviews William Lane Craig. I don't particularly like his speaking presentations, but that's okay. That's just me. All right, so here's him objecting to me, saying there's nothing distinct about Peter in this passage as far as what is said to him is what is said to other apostles. But he says, oh, no, not so fast. The keys are distinct because they're not said about the other apostles.
Back to Matthew. I will give Rock the keys of the kingdom of heaven. What does this actually mean? Are these like literal keys? Did Jesus pull them out of his robe and like drop them into Peter's hand? Of course not, right? This is an idiom. It's a symbolic phrase. And here's sort of the key to understanding idioms in the Bible. We interpret them by how they're used elsewhere, either in scripture or in other ancient writings. And what you know, it turns out we've seen a similar phrase before. In Isaiah 22, we read about a man named Eliakim, who is given, get this, the key to the house of David. That key represented authority, and not just any authority. It was a formal office in the kingdom of Israel. Eliakim is made the royal steward, the prime minister in contemporary terms. He exercises authority. Isaiah says this, in that day I will call my servant Eliakim, and I will commit the steward's authority to his hand. And he shall be a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. And I will place on his shoulder the key of the house of David. He shall open and none shall shut, and he shall shut and none shall open. Sound familiar? When Jesus is giving Peter the keys to the kingdom, he's invoking a very similar structure. Eliakim was given the key of the Davidic kingdom and made David's steward. But Rock is given the keys of the greater heavenly kingdom and made Christ's steward.
Okay, several things here. Now, first of all, the keys is associated with the binding and loosing. That very clearly is said. Let's look at the text again. Now we'll play more of this here in just a second. Is the audio okay, by the way? Now, okay. So he says, no, I'm in Matthew 18. Back in Matthew 16, he says, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven. This is the authority, the same authority given to the apostles. And by the way, the binding and loosing, this is authority to proclaim God's revelation, speak as Christ's representative. That's what an apostle is, an apostle of Christ. Now, you read about other apostles in the New Testament, but these are apostles of churches. Churches send out representatives, and they become apostles in that sense. But an apostle of Christ is someone sent out by Christ to represent him as a mouthpiece for him. They bind what has been bound in heaven. In other words, they speak for heaven. They are leadership of the church, a unique leadership. And a part of the foundation, they were only laid once, by the way. Message for my charismatic friends and Pentecostals. So, this is the special authority they had as apostles to be representatives for Christ. I was looking at the side chat once again. My answer to you, Chris, is no, I don't. But, back to what I'm saying here. This is a part of that authority, and it's the authority given to the rest of the apostles. It's the one given to Paul himself as a representative of Christ. Now, And I'm going to speak about the Isaiah passage here in a second, but that's what it says. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. The binding and loosing is mentioned in Matthew chapter 18. Now, Cameron is going to give an objection to that point, however. So we'll hear that here in a second, but he goes off on this Isaiah thing. And Catholics will often talk about this Isaiah passage. So now to address the Isaiah passage. Where are we here? Let me pull this down. Okay, let me back it up a little bit. And now, Isaiah 22, verse 20. This is what he's referencing. Now, he's trying to link this to Peter, of course. It says, I'll read it once again. He read it, but Isaiah 22, 20. In that day I will call my servant Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, that is, and I will clothe him with your robe and bind. This is royalty, right? This is the language of royalty. This is not literally. I'll give him authority, and I will bind your sash on him. I will commit your authority to his hand, and he shall be a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. And I will place on his shoulder the key of the house of David. He shall open, and none shall shut. He shall shut, and no one shall open. This is authority language, right? And he says, well, we see here the keys. And this is supposedly what he's doing to Peter. He's making him the prime. He's given him, as the king, the associate to the king. And this is Jesus making Peter the associate to himself. Listen to him once again.
House of David. He shall open and none shall shut, and he shall shut and none shall open. Sound familiar? When Jesus is giving Peter the keys to the kingdom, he's invoking a very similar structure. Eliakim was given the key of the Davidic kingdom and made David's steward. But Rock is given the keys of the greater heavenly kingdom and made Christ's steward. But of what? The kingdom of heaven in this context is the church.
Kingdom of heaven in this context is the church. That is true, but this is not a reference to that passage. Just because he mentions keys, well, that's a stretch. And now it's very tempting for a Catholic, of course, to connect this text in Matthew 16 as they interpret it to be establishing Peter as the first pope. It's very tempting if you're a Catholic, I understand, to connect that to Isaiah 22 because of the key language. But, that's a stretch because you have keys, sure enough, but it doesn't reference the passage. But you know where the passage is referenced? Well, it's said about Jesus in the New Testament, sure enough, right? Now, the Catholics, of course, are familiar with this, of course. But it says, "Unto the angel of the church of Philadelphia write, this is what he who is holy, who is true, who has the key of David, who opens and no one will shut, and who shuts and no one open, says." Now that's a specific reference. That is a explicit reference to that passage in Isaiah, and it's about Christ. He has the keys of the kingdom of heaven, or the key of David, that is. He has the key of David. Now, once again, I don't have a huge problem if that is being connected to Peter, because it is the authority to control the kingdom. And apostles are given as representatives of Christ the binding and loosing of teaching and establishing by authority Christ's message. They speak as Christ speaks. In 1 Corinthians 14, Paul the apostle himself says, "Let anybody who is spiritual acknowledge that the things that I have written are the commandments of Christ." So for an apostle to command is for Christ to command. But it's given to all of the apostles. But it's not explicitly said of Peter, but even if it is, it doesn't mean much because, again, the rest of the apostles have the same authority. Now, let's go back to, where was it? Let's go back to Cameron and listen.
Historian of the Church, Charles Gore, says, quote, "Does Christ pass in his promise to St. Peter from words which concern his moral character to words which imply his spiritual
Let me back it up a bit in
concerning
case you
himself?
missed it, because I was talking.
The kingdom of heaven in this context is the church. As Protestant historian of the Church, Charles Gore, says, quote, "Does Christ..."
Yeah, he's quoting a historian of the church.
Quote, does Christ pass in his promise to St. Peter from words which concern his moral character to words which imply his spiritual office? He certainly does. He promises that he will give him the keys of the kingdom of heaven, or of the church. And this is, in other words, promising to make him the official steward of the divine household. The keys don't just like symbolize authority in the abstract. They actually symbolize governing authority over the people of God. So in short, Jesus is saying...
Yes, and the same authority given to the apostles. He told the apostles in another place, you will sit on 12 sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, they did that in their ministry because they were authorities. It's not a literal throne, but they acted in the place of Christ, who is on a throne, and they were representatives of Christ, and they were authority in the Jewish church. It spoke as Christ in the literal tribes of Israel. That's why there was 12, by the way. Now, that's going to be significant here in just a second. There was 12.
You're in charge while I'm away. In other words, the steward leads the church in anticipation of the return of the king. And this fits absolutely perfectly with another scene in John 21, where Jesus tells Rock, feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep. Or in Luke 22, where Jesus tells Rock, strengthen your brother.
Now, the reason he said that, though, and he said it 3 times, because Peter had denied him 3 times, he's trying to encourage him, give him strength. By the way, throughout the New Testament, all the apostles are supposed to be shepherds. In fact, I mean, even non-apostles, even elders are to shepherd. So shepherding, which is just governing authority, shepherding is leadership authority is given to all the apostles. It's even, in a lesser way, given to elders in the church. So the fact that he says it to Peter and Luke 22, he mentioned there, not significant, not significant. He's establishing nothing. This is a very weak case. So my Catholic friends, I'm sorry to say, I mean, honestly, you have a very weak case when it comes to the papacy.
Jesus is entrusting his flock, all of it, to Peter. Is it all that surprising that Jesus would appoint the rock on which he built the church to lead the church in his stead? Now, here's something crucial. This is a very common response here. In Matthew 18:18, Jesus does give the other apostles the power to bind and loose, but he doesn't give them the keys. Take a look at it for yourself.
But he doesn't give them the keys. Okay, so there's Cameron responding to what I said is, now this is said to the apostles in Matthew 18. They were told about binding and loosing, but, he says here, well, but no, he doesn't say anything about the keys. Yes, that's because he isn't using the metaphoric language of building and of opening doors. The keys is a symbol. Now, Cameron even said it early, it's idiomatic. He just doesn't repeat the idiom. He doesn't have to repeat the idiom to communicate the same thing, because it is, in fact, a figure of speech. And it's used in Matthew 16 appropriately because Christ uses the metaphor of building a building, which is figuratively speaking of his people and figuratively speaking of a foundation. And he goes on to use the figure of a key, because you open doors to this figurative building. But he isn't speaking figuratively in Matthew 18. So he doesn't repeat the symbols of the key, but it's still symbolic of the same idea. It's not complicated. It's easy to understand.
18, it says, truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth
Yes, I do have this sped up.
shall be loosed in heaven. The keys are not there. They're reserved for Peter alone in Matthew 16. No one else is recorded as having been given the keys. Not a single person.
Well, I got something more significant for you, Cameron. He says, no one else is given these keys. Listen to that again.
Else is recorded as having been given the keys. In verse 18, it says, truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. The keys are not there. They're reserved for Peter alone in Matthew 16. No one else is recorded as having been given the keys. Not a single person.
Well, it's never mentioned explicitly. Yes, I got something more significant for you here, Cameron. Not only is it not explicitly mentioned, it's never actually on that thought. It's never explicitly stated where he does give him the keys. If the keys is not the giving of this authority to govern that is given to the rest of the apostles and is given in Matthew 16 or Matthew 18, then nowhere do you actually have it said where he gives Peter the keys. Because remember, in Matthew 16, this is future. In Matthew 16, let's look at it. Let me go there. Matthew 16. He says, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. That's future tense. And so if the giving of the keys is not this authority of apostleship given to him as an apostle that is given to everybody else, and you see them exercising in the book of Acts and the epistles, then isn't it significant that this most profound promise of giving and establishing the church on this office of papacy and making him premier above the apostles is never actually given to him in Scripture? It's never actually recorded where it's given to him if the keys is something distinct. Now, ain't that profound? That's more significant than what you just mentioned, Cameron. So I say again, if you're going to make this something distinct given to Peter from the binding and loosing that is given to the apostles elsewhere, then it's never actually recorded to be given to him. But it actually is, because it's a part of this authority of governing that is given to all the apostles. And the key is an ability to open a door and close it well. It means if you have the ability to close and open a door, you have authority over this house, and is figuratively speaking of the church, and all of them did. Whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven. You're controlling how this church operates by being a representative for the one who is the king. That's how this works. I don't think I had anything more from him that I wanted to see. No, not really. From Cameron. But I got to pull that video up. I got another clip of something else here. Now, I got several more things that are going to be of interest, and these things are enlightening if you're a Catholic and you haven't thought about these things, and they're enlightening if you're a Protestant and you're thinking about these things. I got several more important points that you need to stay tuned for. Can we still use the lingo, stay tuned? Because you'd be tuned into a station. I guess it still counts. And by the way, are we still using the floppy disk? I don't even know. My computer doesn't. I guess not. But for a long time, we have been using the floppy disk symbol for save on computers. You know, the save icon is a floppy disk. I guess, I don't know, maybe it's finally gone and obsolete. Floppy disk went out in like the early 90s, or 90s at least. I remember using floppy disk. Even though I'm not old. And for a long time, it remained the save symbol, even when they were, but I guess I don't see them anymore, so I guess they're a thing in the past, even the icon. Okay, but, so, we've established it very well. No, this authority given to Peter is given to the rest of the apostles. Nothing, no succession is mentioned in Matthew 16. No office, really, is mentioned, because he's already been given apostleship. But they're expecting the kingdom, you know, and that's going to be established. But you have something else significant happen later on. So, let's see. Now we have this actually happening in several places. Now I just want to find one to go to here. You know, later on, more than once, you have this discussion by the apostles, who's going to be the greatest? Now, that's not insignificant, because if they're still debating who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom, and that's what it says in other places too, you have this discussion happen where who's the greatest in the kingdom? Well, you have it here also in Luke 22, and it says there arose a dispute among them as which one of them would be regarded to be the greatest. And he said to them, the kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who have authority over them are called benefactors. But not so among you, or not so with you. Rather, the one who is greatest among you must become like the youngest, and the leader like the servant. For who is greater, the one who reclines at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines? talking about himself, but I am among you as one who serves. Now we're going to talk about this. This is pretty significant because they obviously did not understand Peter to be established as the preeminent one among them, right? Because they're still arguing about who's going to be the greatest. Now remember, the reason they could have this discussion is because they still are perceiving the kingdom to be a typical political kingdom, that he's still going to establish this where you got levels of hierarchy. This is typical what happens, in kingdoms, right? And so this is why they could have discussions about who's going to be the greatest. Am I going to be above you? What position am I going to occupy? Haven't all grasped this yet. But they wouldn't be having this discussion if Peter's going to be the greatest. If the Pope is the greatest, it's the highest level when it comes to hierarchy. And you don't see Peter saying, hey, oh, wait a minute. He already told you, I'm the Pope here. I'm Papa here. I'm the Papa. So, argument ended, And Jesus doesn't end it by saying, hey, I've already established the Papa. The Papa's done. No more Papa discussion. The Papa has been appointed in position. But, that's not what happens, right? There's no Papa appointments because there is no papacy. And, well, if that's what had happened in Matthew 16, then you wouldn't be having this discussion. But, some of our Catholic friends have an argument for this. Now, we're going to return to this. But Trent Horn has more to say on this. Here's him and Joe something talking about it.
But I think the one that is worth mentioning the most is Luke 22.
Okay, once again, Joe is the one talking, and so the other person that you will hear talking is Trent. Now, the context here is them discussing a underestimated proof text for the papacy, one that is not discussed enough, but one that he thinks is stronger than people give it credit for. That's the background here. So Trent had asked Joe about it, and here's Joe's answer.
But I think the one that is worth mentioning the most is Luke 22, in which at the Last Supper, the disciples start debating which of them is the greatest. And the reason I like it is because a lot of times when evangelicals say they reject the papacy, it turns out they have a really kind of comically skewed understanding of the Pope and his role.
Right.
Where the Pope is the guy who just decides every issue and every doctrine, and he can just change church teaching if he wants to, and that's just not what Catholics actually believe about the papacy.
They think the Pope is like some kind of a king or a tyrant
right,
over the church.
It's something that's at least as powerful as the Mormon president, and maybe more powerful. And it's just that's just not the view, and it's not a good Christian view of leadership at all.
And by the way, I'm going to come back to that king statement, which I found very interesting. But anyway, we'll come back to that.
And not a good view of the papacy specifically.
Because I think some people, and the passage that we're going to talk about is it Luke 22?
Yeah, Luke 22. Really, I like to begin it with verse 24. The heart of it is verse 30 to 31.
And so it's the dispute about greatness. And I know some Protestants will say, well, Jesus in the dispute about greatness, when the disciples asked, who is the greatest among you? If Peter were the Pope, why didn't Jesus say, Peter is the greatest among you? Because he is the Pope. The end.
Yeah. The amazing thing is, if you actually read the full
yes,
chapter,
and that's a good argument.
He almost does that.
Yeah, well, tell us more.
Okay.
How it points that direction.
Yeah, that's exactly, and that's a good argument, Trent, too. But I talked over what they were saying. So
the amazing thing is, if you actually read the full chapter, he almost does that.
Yeah, well, tell us more. How it points that direction.
So the first thing that I think is really interesting about this is he doesn't say no to their question. He doesn't say, "Well, you're all equal. You're all equally great." There's none of that. Every time they argue.
Oh man. No offense, but that is based upon such a lack of understanding of the passage. So Joe here says, Jesus doesn't say, well, you're all equal. Yes, because that would be contrary to the point that Jesus wants to actually make. You see, he's the whole point of what Jesus' response is to not say, oh, no, you're all equal. It's to say, no, if you want to be great, become least. He's wanting to tell them that they need a complete change of attitude. Saying they were all equal would be fine if they were all incredibly great. You could all be great. If he said to them, you're all equal, well, they could still argue about how great they are. They could still walk away saying, well, they're all great, they're just equal. So Joel misses the whole point. He wants to lessen their valuation of themselves. He wants them to have a change of attitude that they're supposed to be humble. You could say they're all great and still think you're all great. Rather, he could tell them they're all equal, but yet they're still all great and still have a puffed up attitude. They're just all puffed up. No, Jesus wants to say, lower your attitude, lower your self-evaluation. Don't seek to be great at all. Joel, I don't know you, Joel, but that was not a good answer. You completely bypassed Jesus' point because you don't understand it. It's amazing that you could look at this passage and still try to see, because this is what ultimately he's going to do if we listen, the primacy of Peter made. So we'll go back to the clip.
Great. There's none of that. Every time they argue about greatness, he never rebukes them. He never corrects them. He always just tells them how to be greater.
Right.
And
so he acknowledges there's being greater and a greatest.
Exactly.
Yes, and it's about one's mentality and self-evaluation and one's pride. That's what his answers are about. He always tells you how to be the greatest. Well, and they think that this is evidence for the papacy. Remember, that's the context of the discussion. An underrated, an underused proof text or argument for the papacy. And so what are they really saying? Jesus is really still affirming you can be the greatest. So it is amazing, really, how far away they are from Jesus' teaching. You know what they're really going to need? They're going to need an infallible teaching on this because they're not interpreting it well. But so what they're saying is, no, Jesus is affirming that there's going to be the greatest. Yeah, so in the passage where Jesus is trying to get them to act humble and stop endeavoring to be high and seek positions of highness, they're supposed to lower themselves to service. And still somehow Jesus is affirming the highest form, how to be a pope. Talk about blinders. You talk about they have not taken off the Catholic blinders, or they have not taken off the Catholic lens. I mean, they're seeing exactly what they want to see in the passage. That's amazing.
And with it, so he says a couple things. In verse 28 and 29, he describes them as those who stood with him in his trials and who will judge the angels in heaven. That's on 12 thrones,
right,
which affirms that the apostles have a special authority, an eternal authority. This is a small point, but an important one for those who may be familiar with dispensationalism, that views as a church age that comes to an end, in which the whole apostolic structure goes.
Okay, yes. So, as I agree, this is the position of the authority is given to 12 apostles. 12, not just one higher one and then 11 lower ones. No, 12 apostles. And that's the kind of governance that Peter has in the New Testament that we see. That's the only one we see him operating. Besides what you will also see that is unique to every individual. Paul has something unique about him. Peter has something unique about him. James has something unique. This is the uniqueness that comes with their individuality, which cannot be given to other people. Peter's personal leadership can be unique from other leaders, even that occupy the same authority. How is that? Well, by the personal characteristics that he brings as a person, those are not things that can be just simply handed via succession to other people. So things that will be unique are going to be unique to the individual, not to the position. Because by definition of a position that can be succeeded or given by succession, it's not going to be distinct and unique to the person. You see things about James that are different than Peter and things about Paul that are different from both, because those are distinctions in their leadership rooted in them as people, and those are not things that can be given to other people who occupy the position that they have. But they look at this passage and still see proof of a papacy in which he's not even talking about. You see, they have failed to see the very thing that the apostles were missing in the moment. They are making the same error that the apostles are making in the conversation. And when Jesus rebukes the apostles, they miss the rebuke. It's the most ironic thing. Is that irony? You see, they are arguing over who will have these higher levels of position in the kingdom. And Jesus is saying there's not going to be any of that. You need to have an attitude of service. That will make you great. The attitude will make you great. And here they are saying, they're missing it and saying, yeah, actually, this is affirming that there will be a high position of authority in the church. You're missing it, man. You're missing it. In fact, look at the passage. Jesus is saying the kings and the Gentiles lord it over them, just like, the empires and the kingdoms of the nations, that's what he means. They have these positions, and those who occupy these positions act as lords and kings over these people because of the position. They get to say, you do this, and they get to command. Just because of the position, they get to be served. That's what he's saying. Because in political kingdoms, as he's pointing to, he's saying, you know how it works. Because they occupy a position of authority, they get served, and they lord authority over people, and they get served. By the way, that's exactly what the Pope does. People serve him, and they carry out. People come to him, and they even drive him around. He's got countless people that help him carry out this office. People bow down to him. They kiss his ring. Yes, he's treated as a king. Absolutely. We're going to return to that point that they made here in just a second. But he's treated because of the office that he occupies. He is served. And that's what he's saying is exactly not what's going to happen in my kingdom. I'm not going to have that kind of positions of authority where you're going to be served. No, actually, you need to act as a servant. You will have authority. We know that. And so when he says the least will be the greatest, he's speaking simply by means of a paradox. You're going to be considered the greatest by being more humble. He's not actually affirming a great position. Now, they will have a high position of authority, but he's not addressing that here. He's saying if you really want to be great, just act like a servant. That'll take care of it. Jesus is saying, look at me. He's saying, who's greater, the one who reclines at the table or the one who serves? Well, obviously, he's saying, it's implied, it's the one who reclines at the table because he's being waited on. He's being fed the grapes or whatever it is, right? He's saying, but how do I act? I act as one who serves. So if you want to be great, be like me. Well, the Pope and Jesus do not act the same. One walked around in humility. One walks around in royal robes, being treated, as a king. So just the opposite. And by the way, they don't act like, here's something else. Every Catholic needs to understand it. And if you're a Protestant or a Catholic who's trying to decide on these issues, let me tell you something. You will not find Peter anywhere, any indication in the epistles where he began to wear royal robes, sit in a royal throne, and people came to him and bowed down. Just the opposite. When people bowed down to him, like Cornelius in Acts 10, he rebuked him. But it happens all the time with the Pope. He never had royal, grandioso titles. First of all, like Holy Father, the Pontiff, these kinds of things that we give to the Pope, Peter never had it. That should tell you something. And what it should tell you, along with everything else that I've said, is that this was an invention of people centuries after Christianity began. So if you're going to be like Peter, why don't you act like Peter? Now, but they said something related to this very point that I'm making about people have this expectation that the Pope is some kind of king.
If he wants to, and that's just not what Catholics actually believe about.
They think the
papacy.
Pope is like some kind of a king or a tyrant
Right,
over the church.
it's something.
So Catholics don't believe that the Pope is a king? Now, I found that very interesting. Now look at that picture. Now, if you're just listening, you can't see it. But here's a picture of, now this is actually Pope Benedict. sitting in what looks like the typical kingly chair. Looks like gold to me. Now, I'm colorblind, and I'm pretty sure that's gold. Looks like the kind of throne that you would typically expect of kings that we've always seen in movies, TV shows, and traditionally associated. He's sitting in it with these royal garb type clothes on, and there's somebody bowing down in front of him as he sits, and they're kissing his hand. But Trent Horn says, as if we think that the Pope is some kind of king. Well, if that's not how a king is treated, dresses, and sits, then I don't know what would be. Right? Okay, now I have another one. Doesn't that look like a king to you? So here's a picture. Now, once again, now I just got random pictures. I should have got more of Pope Francis because he was the most modern one. But here, once again, is Pope Benedict walking, everybody behind him. He's got a big flowing robe of gold on. Now, think about it. A robe of gold and a gold hat. I forget what they call that, but it's large golden crown-like hat. And he's holding a cross-like scepter made of gold in his hand. And isn't that what kings do? They wear crowns and gold and robes, and they have scepters. And he's got a big bonnet or sash here going on. And Trent Horn says, as if Catholics think that the Pope is a king. Well, if that isn't the typical imagery of how a king looks, and what a king wears, I don't know what would be. Yeah, we think of the Pope as a king in the Catholic Church because he is. In fact, the Catholics call the Pope the vicar of Christ. You know what vicar means? It means in place of. Have you ever heard of vicarious? So the Pope is in place of Christ. What was Christ? A king. So he's in the place of the king, right? Yeah. Okay. So I want you to listen to it again, what Trent Horn said, or both of them said.
He wants to, and that's just not what Catholics actually believe about
They
the
think
papacy.
the Pope is like some kind of a king or a tyrant
Right,
over the church.
it's something that's...
Okay. Well, how about this one? Yeah, it looks pretty much like a king sitting on his throne. Here's another picture of, now this is Pope Francis. He's sitting on a big, grand-looking throne. It's a throne is what it is. It's got gold in it. It's large. It's got platforms under it. There's people sitting to the sides of him, and who are not sitting on things that look like that. He's got a big robe on. He's wearing a crown-looking hat once again. And isn't that what we think of when we think of kings? Well, yeah, it's kings. In fact, he's when world leaders, they want to talk to somebody in the Catholic Church, they go to the Pope because he's the king of the Catholic Church. Of course he is. He's treated as a king. So, I mean, please, I don't know what in the world they think they're talking about, but that is exactly what Catholics believe. In fact, I'll give you something else that's interesting. I pulled this up. I pulled up a statement. This is a statement from VaticanCityTours.it. Now, I assume this is associated with the Vatican. I don't know. It's Vatican City Tours. They have to have some connection to them to be doing it. But it doesn't matter. A mitre, yeah. A mitre, yeah. So that's what it was called. Okay. Now, from the Vatican City Tours, where they give tours of the Vatican, it happened to say this about the Pope. I'll have to get out of the way here. The office of the Pope is referred to as the papacy. The Pope rules the Catholic Church in a very similar way to a king. What a country. And he is the head of state for the Vatican City. For the city. The Roman Curia, you might remember them to be the cardinals, help the Pope to complete his duties. Now, that's funny that I just happened to come across that. It says, The Pope rules the Catholic Church in a very similar way to a king. Yeah, well, that's because that's what he is for the Catholic Church. Sure enough. All right. So, yeah, that's what he does. Now, there's only one spot where you would have something akin to succession, and it's a succession of an apostle. Now, that is Acts chapter 1, where Judas is replaced. Now here they are, the apostles gathered. Now it says, in those days, Peter, this is Acts 1, chapter 1, verse 15, and in those days Peter stood up in the midst of the brothers. A crowd of about 120 persons was there together, and said, Men, brothers, the scripture had to be fulfilled, which the Holy Spirit foretold by the mouth of David concerning Judas, who became a guide to those who arrested Jesus, for he was counted among us and received his share in this ministry. Well, what ministry? That's the apostleship, right? Now, this man acquired a field. Okay, he died. Okay, now he goes on in verse 20 to say, For it is written in the book of Psalms, let his residence be made desolate, and let no one dwell in it, and let another man take his office. Okay, but he was an apostle. So yes, you do have somebody filling the place of an apostle here. Okay, now why is that? Well, number one, it doesn't even matter because it's not the succession or the replacing of a pope, the office that Peter held, as unique from the apostles, and there was no such office, never seen. Very interesting that you never have this replacement of papacy. But the reason an apostle, number one, there's two reasons we gather into here. One thing that is stated that Judas is being replaced is because there is an Old Testament prophecy about it. And the qualifications, he goes on to say, therefore, Peter says this, it is necessary that of the men who have accompanied us all the time that the Lord Jesus went in and out among us, beginning with the baptism of John until the day that he was taken up from us, one of these must become a witness with us of his resurrection. So the qualifications of who must replace the apostle Judas was that they had to be among them who had been with Jesus in his ministry and witnessed his resurrection. Well, I mean, so that's irrelevant to anybody today, even if it was about the papacy, which it is not. And this is the only thing you see. There's something more significant here. Well, very much a part of what is being said, which is the reason in the first place there even was a replacement of Judas. Because you don't actually see this happen again in the New Testament. Why? Well, it goes back to a passage that was discussed earlier, where Jesus says, you will sit on 12 in the regeneration. In the regeneration, you will sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, have you ever thought about that passage? You ever thought about that passage? What does it mean? Now, he says in the... Actually, let's just go there while we're talking about it. So, let's see. That is in Matthew 19. Which would be where he was talking about the kingdom. Actually, he was talking then about who is the greatest. Okay, he says, truly I say to you that you who have followed me in the regeneration when the Son of Man will sit on his glorious throne, you also shall sit upon 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay, now, unless you're a dispensationalist, we're going to have a whole discussion. But the kingdom has already been established. That's very easy to see, though. There should be no argument about it. In Colossians 1, Paul says we Christians have been transferred into the kingdom of his dear Son. I mean, the kingdom is everywhere in the book of Acts. And anyway, so the kingdom has been established now since the era of Christ. And he already sits on the throne. You could read about his sitting on his throne in Acts chapter 2. You could read about it in Revelation chapter 3. And he says in Revelation, Jesus says, to him who overcomes, I will grant to sit with me on my throne, even as I overcame and sat down with my Father on his throne. So yes, throne here is just a symbol. He's not sitting on a literal throne. The throne is a symbol of authority. He does occupy this place of kingship in heaven right now over the church, over the kingdom. So he figuratively sits on a throne. That's what this throne is always going to be. Now, and he says to them, you will sit on 12 thrones. Not literally, but you will occupy as my representatives. Royal. And by the way, if anybody's a king, well, if Peter was a king as a representative of Christ, so was the other apostles. And he's already sitting on the throne now, Christ is. So that's the Christian era. Okay. When Christ ascended, well, let me say, after his resurrection, he said in Matthew 28, I have been given all authority on heaven and earth, in heaven and earth. Well, that was him being exalted to kingship, officially, crowned, if you will. Because there could be no more authority that a king would have in the future, Christ that is, than all authority in heaven and earth. So he's already king. Okay. So he says, in the regeneration, when the Son of Man will sit on his glorious throne. Well, that's the Christian era. But he says, in the regeneration. Well, there's only one other place where that word regeneration is used. Paul in Titus 3 talks about the washing of regeneration. He associates that with salvation. Regenerations mean new life, to live again, to be regenerated. Now, Calvinists have kind of hijacked that word and kind of given it this whole distinct meaning that I don't agree with. But regeneration is new life. Well, the era of new life is the era of salvation, which, of course, is the Christian era. Well, he says, you shall sit upon 12 thrones. The apostles occupy in the Christian era a particular place of prominence. Even now, when we read the New Testament, the reason there's authority behind these letters is because I'm talking about the epistles and letters in the New Testament. The reason they carry authority for us still this day is because they were either written by or associated with somebody who was with an apostle. So their authority laid down in the foundation in the first part of the Christian era, that authority still carries on through their writings. See how that works? Now, it says they will judge the 12 tribes of Israel. Yes, when they ministered, they were special authorities as Christ's representatives going about in Israel. Now think about this. You ever think about Paul? Well, there's 12 apostles, but then there's Paul. Well, Paul was he was kind of a 13th apostle. And people don't think about that, but he wasn't one of the 12. Now, why? Because he had a distinct function as an apostle of Christ. He was primarily sent to the nations, the Gentiles. The 12 apostles were primarily sent to Israel. Now, yes, they also talked to Gentiles, and Paul, talked to the Jews. But his main work, go to Ephesians chapter 3, he was a minister for the Gentiles. His main work was among the Gentiles. That's why he's not among the 12, really. He's the 13th, but because he's an apostle for the Gentiles, he had a distinct apostleship. Well, you had 12 apostles, which included Peter, James, John, these 12 that we usually think of. Their primary role by Christ was to Israel in the early part of the church. Does that make sense? Well, so now you can understand why there were 12. You ever asked the question, why 12 apostles? As a matter of fact, people get confused because they start asking, well, how come there was 12? And wasn't there really more than 12 with Paul? Well, I just explained why that is, because he didn't have the same role as the 12. Now, the reason there was 12 is because there was 12 tribes of Israel, and they were representatives to the 12 tribes of Israel. That's why To bring this full circle, that's why there was a replacement for Judas, because there needed to be 12, because there were 12 tribes. That's what this was about. This was a group of special appointees, apostles of Christ, being sent out to Israel, and that was always their primary mission. So Christ wanted 12, and that's why when they just began their work of witnessing, there needed to be a replacement for Judas, because there needed to be 12. Now, later on, after they started to do their work and the gospel began to be preached and the church began to take a hold in the population, well, once they started to die, there didn't need to be a replacement anymore, because their duty had already started and being carried out. And that's why in Acts chapter 1, the replacement had to have the qualifications of being a witness for Jesus' resurrection and ministering with him, because the apostles were witnesses of his resurrection. Paul the apostle witnessed the ascended Christ. He saw him on the road to Damascus. He didn't just see a vision. He saw Jesus with his own eyes. Jesus appeared to Paul's eyeballs. So he was a witness of his resurrection. That's what made him an apostle. By the way, side issue, it's common language and lingo in evangelism these days for people to speak about being a witness. And what they mean is they evangelize, they preach the gospel, maybe tell what Christ has done for them. They witness. That's what people talk about. They say, have you witnessed for Jesus today? Well, I went out today knocking on doors, preaching, and so I did some witnessing for Jesus. That's a misuse of the word. In the New Testament, the witnesses actually witnessed something. They witnessed the resurrection of Christ. The apostles were special witnesses, and others had witnessed his resurrection as well. But nobody witnessed anything about Jesus today. So nobody's witnessing in that sense. So we should drop that lingo. If you're either preaching or teaching, but you're not witnessing. Okay, so all this makes sense? Well, it should make sense. That's why you have this authority be given to all the apostles, because all of them as a group were a special appointment to the tribes of Israel. You have Paul the apostle now, to bring this full circle, makes no mention of the Pope. He mentions that the apostles were first, but actually the Catholic Church claims that the papacy is first, preeminent. When he talks about the foundation in Ephesians 2, he does not mention the papacy, never mentions the papacy. Acts chapter 15, when there's a council in Jerusalem to decide certain things, Peter speaks, but Paul speaks. And then James, the brother of the Lord, in the early church, he has the final say. So he actually has some leadership. Now, does Peter carry some special preeminence? Yes, in his person. He was a leading leader of the church. But I already told you, you could share an office with other people that they have, but you still have some preeminence in your work, in your individual characteristics. You could have a group of elders in a church. They all have the same office. They all have the same authority. But you could have one elder that stands out and takes a leading role among the others. That's why sometimes you see him first mentioned in list. I'll give you a clear example of how this is the case. Even among the 12 apostles, so even the Catholics acknowledge that the apostleship, you had 12 occupying that office, right? Well, but you had 3 that had even a special place close to Christ. Peter, James, and John. Now, they all had the same authority, but they had a closer relationship. They kind of stood out. Now, in Galatians 2, when Paul goes to Jerusalem, he doesn't seek out the Pope, right? He doesn't seek out the Pope. He talks to Peter and he talks to James. He says he were those of reputation contributed nothing to me, but on the contrary, seeing that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been to the circumcised. Notice that Peter is singled out here as someone preaching among the Jews, not as just a pope over everybody or the whole church. Okay, and then he says, and recognizing the grace that had been given to me, James and Cephas, that's Peter, and John, who were reputed to be pillars. Yeah, John, Peter, James, pillars, even among other apostles. But again, Peter isn't singled out as preeminent above everybody. There is no papacy in the New Testament. It was invented later. Everybody should think about these things. Okay, I didn't finish my point about James in Acts 15. James actually, if anybody, gives the deciding declaration. Okay, but I don't want to spend time on that. I want to bring this to a close. I want to say this. I know the Catholics, my Catholic friends, you have tradition, that you take your appointed tradition as authority as well as Scripture. But I want everybody to think about this. You say, okay, yes, but remember the Catholics, they have another authority, and that's tradition, not just the Bible. Well, but remember, let me tell you something about the Bible. Because the Catholics concede that the New Testament is an authority as well. Well, I wish it would stop doing that. Notice this in chapter, and there's plenty of scriptures on this. Look at my videos on Sola Scriptura, and you'll see me talk about this. So here is Paul going down to Berea. It says, now these refers to the Bereans. Now these were more noble-minded than those in Thessalonica. Why? For they received the word with great eagerness, examining the Scriptures daily to see whether these things were so. Now, really, I should have read verse 10. Makes a little bit more sense. Let me read verse 10, which is before what I just read. And the brothers immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. And when they arrived, they went into the synagogue of the Jews. So Paul and Silas go to Berea and they preach. And so then it says, these of Berea were more noble-minded because they received the word, the preaching, with great eagerness, examining the Scriptures. What Scriptures would they have had at this time? The Old Testament Scriptures. Daily, to see whether these things being preached by Paul and Silas were so. Think about that. Anytime God's revelation becomes inscripturated and becomes given into the possession of God's people, like the Old Testament did, it becomes a judge of further revelation, even further revelation from an apostle. Here's Paul going in there, and they don't need an infallible interpreter. They don't even have one. And they don't go to Peter. Paul doesn't say, go to Peter and he'll interpret the Scriptures for you. No, they look themselves to Scripture to judge the revelation coming from even an apostle himself, Paul, to see. They have to validate what new revelation is, whether it is new revelation, by using that which has already been established as God's revelation. Prior revelation of God becomes a light for further revelation. Now, there is a sense in which New Testament revelation gives light to the Old Testament, but that's in like typology, shedding light, knowledge that we don't have. That's not what I'm referring to. But they had to see whether these things that Paul spoke could be validated and substantiated by what God has already said, because it can't be contradicting. That's the point. It can't be contradicting what has already been inscripturated with God's revelation. So Scripture is preeminent to new revelation. And when the Catholic Church can come along and says, now we've declared dogmatically that this tradition is really a tradition that was taught by the apostles. Well, that's new revelation to me. And guess what? You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take Scripture and judge. So if you can tell me all day long, you could tell me for 1,500 years that there's a papacy, that Peter was the first pope, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take the good book and I'm going to judge it. And I just did that through this whole program, and I think anybody can see there ain't no papacy, and contrary to it. And if Jesus didn't establish it in his ministry, well, then your claims are false. And if you can't judge the passage in Matthew 16 correctly, how am I going to trust you on other things that are more complicated? Well, I'm not. That's why I'm not a Catholic. There is no papacy, hasn't been around for 2,000 years. This was invented after the fact. So this tradition that we're all going to be hearing about in the news, in days to come when they're appointing the new pope, didn't come from Christ. It came from man, and I place no significance theologically in it. All right, well, that's it. I appreciate you guys being a part of the podcast. Share it once again, like and subscribe, tell everybody else about it. I hope that you were enlightened by the things that were said. Good night, and God bless.